In today's Farm Report, education is valuable for many reasons, whether it is to refresh already known knowledge or to learn something new. Dan Martins with the University of Minnesota Extension Service Office talks about some of the educational opportunities that Extension puts on.
I liked having the chance at pesticide applicator workshops during the past week to hear how farmers are looking at some of the topics we cover, questions, challenges they see, and helpful strategies they have discovered. Sometimes we maybe get a little too caught up with the notion that there's a perfect way to do everything and lose some consideration for the fact that weather, time, money, and other factors can change the game and limit how perfectly we can get things done. We talked a little bit about how common sense is a huge asset as farmers deal with making the best of the cards that get dealt through the day and through the season. That's true about many careers and perhaps for life in general. Farmers also look for what they can learn along the way, and that's true in other avenues of life too. Speaking of learning, I saw an email recently from U of M Extension entomologist Robert Cook about soybean aphids, something we talked a little bit about at these workshops. Bob wrote that while soybean aphids are waiting out the winter as eggs on buckthorn, you can prepare yourself to manage these pests in 2015 by watching a series of webcasts. 3 webcasts focus on soybean aphid management. You can find them by doing a website search for Plant Management Network or Focus on Soybean. The webcasts are the result of a multi-state, multi-year research and outreach effort. They're about 15 minutes long, so pretty convenient to view. If you'd like written information about some of this, we can probably help you with that too. Topics: host plant resistance for soybean aphids, management using neonicotinoid-treated seed, update on soybean aphid biological control. I watched one yesterday and found it to be useful information. I had a couple of questions I wanted to ask, so it doesn't fully replace live meetings where you can have some discussion. So in that vein, I hope to see some of you at the Forage Crop Workshop on Wednesday, February 4 at the El Paso Restaurant in St. Joe along County Highway 25 that runs between Division Street in St. Cloud and I-94. Registration starts at 9:30. $30 at the door. I think you'll gain from some live discussion about low-lignin alfalfa, use of drones or UAVs, forage fertilizer practices, nitrogen management with alfalfa credits, and alternative or emergency forages. Or we might see you at the workshop on managing soil phosphorus levels on livestock farms and rice at the Lions Building on Friday, February 6 from 10 to 12:15 with a lunch following. Extension educator Randy Pepin will share what he has learned in visiting dairy farms and beef feedlots in central and southeast Minnesota. And then you'll have some time for other things in the afternoon. Randy will be in Little Falls, Cold Spring, and Sauk Center at later dates. I'm Dan Martins with U of M Extension. Thanks for the chance to visit with you this week.
Starting Monday, the world comes to Colorado's White River National Forest for the International Ski Federation Alpine World Ski Championships.
The Alpine World Ski Championships occur every 2 years, and it alternates with the Olympic Games. In the world of ski racing, this is on par with those Olympic events and is actually the same athletes that are competing for their countries.
And Don Dressler of the U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain region says this international event coincides with the centennial anniversary of the Term Occupancy Act, which allows winter sports facilities and ski areas to be developed in our nation's forest.
We have 122 ski areas that operate on National Forest System land. Approximately 30 million skier visits each year across those areas, and that equates to quite a bit of money in local revenues.
The Alpine World Ski Championships will be held at Vail Beaver Creek for 2 weeks through February 15th. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
The effects of climate change are impacting everyone. Agriculture may be especially impacted. Jim Solver with the University of Minnesota Extension Service Office explains.
I maybe focus a little bit more on agriculture and labor productivity versus just kind of general. But they're expecting, again, this was a study that was done with a bunch of researchers from around the country. Looks like a pretty reputable group at some universities. They kind of looked at long-term changes and the potential effect that that might have. They're expecting that the change in temp and precipitation will shift ag patterns and affect crop yields, with gains in certain areas, which you might expect, and losses in others. Fortunately, the farther north you are, the more likely you are of an increase. They're expecting, like Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana, to have smaller crops because of it. On the other hand, that the warmer winters and longer growing season really will extend growing season Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Dakotas, and Michigan. And they're arguing that we may, by the end of the century, be able to do some double cropping in Minnesota. And you're seeing a lot of interest in that right now. We kind of call it cover cropping or double cropping. But you really are beginning to see some of that, or at least discussion about that in Minnesota right now. As I mentioned on Saturday, precipitation is more extreme, and so we're likely to see larger rainfall events, which may mean from an agricultural standpoint, more flooding, maybe harder to get crops in, more land that floods out, putting more stress on like our drainage systems and our lakes and rivers and streams. I guess we know that already. Another I thought was interesting, that rising temperatures will reduce labor productivity. So you work outside in those real hot weathers, particularly in people that work outside with construction. The other thing they said is that it'll increase crime, and they picked out Minneapolis-St. Paul as an area, and they're expecting crime rates to rise by as much as 6.4%. So I guess when we say that our cold temperature kind of keeps the riffraff out, or at least keeps them off the streets, I thought that was kind of an interesting that they concluded that crime will probably go up. And as I mentioned again on Saturday, that it will likely benefit from reduced cold weather mortality, a little more in the summer weather. From an energy standpoint, I'm not quite sure what that means, because of course we'll use less propane and natural gas in the winter, or electricity, whatever you use to heat your home, but then you're probably running air conditioning more, so you use more energy there. So I think at least their conclusion was that, at least for the northern climates, this may be a wash. So I hope you find that interesting. I think it's always interesting to think a little bit. I'll be long gone before I think there's any concern, at least with a lot of these things, but I think it's something we really need to think about, and maybe how our businesses or agriculture may be changing as we move forward if these trends continue. This has been Jim Salfer with the University of Minnesota Extension in St. Cloud.
The first increase in the beef cattle herd since 2007 and the beef cow inventory since 2006.
It is a sign that possibly that we have turned the corner.
Agriculture Department livestock analyst Sheo Shagham's comments after seeing the new and surprising USDA cattle inventory report showing beef replacement heifers January 1st up 4% from a year ago. Beef cows that have calved up 2%. Total inventory cattle and calves 89.8 million head up 1%.
The size of the increase will take some of the industry analysts by surprise.
Most were expecting smaller increases. Shagam says conditions do favor expansion, better forage, lower grain prices, higher cattle prices. Of course, even as producers start now to hold back heifers for breeding, it could be 2 years before they come into the market. And in the meantime,
we're still going to be tight animals,
sending cattle prices this year to expected new record highs despite recent price declines. But at least producers have begun the process of expansion. However, a drought and cutbacks in forage supplies this summer could stop that process in its tracks. In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
The food supply has inherent risks and sometimes can be questioned. Jim Sulphur with the University of Minnesota Extension Service Office shares more.
If I look at the back of my business card or look at our University of Minnesota mission, and what we talk about a lot is that our goal or our mission as University of Minnesota Extension is to bring unbiased, research-based information to an education to people and whatever the clients are. And of course, my clients really are primarily dairy farmers and the people that support them. But I'd like to admit, first of all, that science isn't perfect. So I'm going to talk a little bit today on editorials, because I get a lot of, or editorialize on that a little bit, because I get a lot of challenges, I think, from relatives or friends that know me well, and they'll say, Jim, are you absolutely positively sure, fill in the blank, RBST, Roundup Ready, corn, Roundup Ready, soybeans, pick your poison, and they'll say is safe and doesn't affect our water supply. And I like to respond back to them and say, no, that isn't really what science does. And science has been known to be wrong. I think if we go back many centuries, we thought the world was flat, and we discovered that the world is round. So science isn't perfect. Once upon a time, many decades ago, I guess not many decades ago, but science said that DDT was okay to use. Now, I'm not beating up science. I very, very much believe in science. But I think the point is that we need to think about science as trying to understand risks, especially when it comes to these products that come out. And I think science overall and universities do a really good job of trying to research that and making sure that our food supply is safe. Our food supply is getting safer every single year. If you really look at the data, you may not believe that if you listen to the radio, but part of that is just how fast news travels. If there's an outbreak of a foodborne illness somewhere in California, we hear about it within a half an hour, whereas 20 years ago you may not have heard about it at all. But I think the important to think about is really what is the risk involved with these particular industries. And if they're very well researched, the risk is very, very, very low. And I kind of analyze it when people challenge me, say, you're going to drive a car home tonight if you're somewhere. Is there a zero risk that you're not going to get in an accident? No, I think we all will admit that. There's a fairly likelihood. But yet when it comes to food supplies, we want someone to guarantee us there's an absolute zero risk, and that'll never happen. But I can say, based on the research-based information, most of the information you can read that comes out from us, comes out from other people, your risk is extremely low because it's very well researched, and that research says there's no risk. But in reality, I can't ever say that there's zero risk. So I think when we think about things that we read, we need to really kind of keep it in the context of risk and how much risk we're willing to take. This is Jim Salfer with the University of Minnesota Extension in St. Cloud.
At the Agriculture Department Monday, USDA releasing its proposed fiscal year 2016 budget numbers.
But a budget actually, I think, is obviously much more than just numbers. It's an expression of values, and I think it ought to be a roadmap to a brighter and better future.
Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack telling reporters he's proposing a total USDA spending level that will be 3% higher than this year, still below 2010's proposed levels. Vilsack proposing more money for research and more resources for beginning farmers, but a cut of about $1.5 billion for crop insurance subsidies. Vilsack told reporters the background for this. He said to get the votes to get the Farm Bill passed in Congress.
One of the challenges was to create sufficient savings to satisfy everyone that we were going to, over the time, spend less money.
But with crop prices plunging precipitously, farm program payments will be higher than had been expected, so Vilsack is looking at adjusting rates, subsidies, and payments for prevented planting and harvest price loss coverage. So with less outlays for crop insurance, more for farm safety net programs, you get total Farm Bill spending back to promised or expected levels. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of